All right, everybody, we have a live feed right now back in the George Burch case. Ed Jackson is back on the stand. Now, it should be noted that there was a back and forth between the attorneys and the judge about allowing the questioning of Burch not paying rent, because let's not forget, Ed Jackson lived with Burch at the time of the murder. And that questioning about whether somebody didn't pay rent, is that kind of besmirch Burch's character? The judge ruled it not. It doesn't. So that's going to be let in. Before we go to a live feed, let me just introduce my guest right now, Law and Crime trial analyst and fellow host here on the network, Stephanie Willis. Stephanie, good to see you.
Good seeing you too. Thanks so much for having me on this morning.
Of course. Now, I want us to listen in and stay where you are. Stay where, because we have a lot to talk about, both this case and the Bradley Farrington case out of New Mexico. But let's go right now live into the George Burch courtroom.
2016. It was a Friday.
Yep.
You do, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have plans for that weekend?
Yes.
What were you going to do?
Fishing trip down in Racine.
Who was going?
Me and George and Mike, the owner of the boat.
Okay. Now, did you call the defendant George?
No.
What did you call him?
I called him Steve.
Did he have other nicknames?
Big Country.
When you knew him out east, did you know him as Steve?
Steve, yes.
Did you sometimes go out to taverns with the defendant?
Occasionally.
Did you ever go to Richard Cranium's with him?
Once or twice, yes.
Now, you said this boating trip down in Racine. Who all was going?
Me, Steve, and Mike the captain, and Jimmy the mate.
Do you know Mike's full name?
Mike Hankey.
Who owned the boat?
Mike.
And what would you guys fish for?
Salmon.
Did you go out on Lake Michigan?
Yes.
The night before, do you recall about what time you went to bed?
About 10:30, 11 o'clock.
Do you remember what time you got up the next morning?
It was about 7 o'clock.
7 a.m.?
Yep.
What'd you do in the morning?
Let the dogs out.
How many dogs do you have?
2.
Do you stay up?
Yes.
What were you going to do that morning?
Build a herb garden for my wife.
Oh, on your property?
Yes.
What kind of herbs?
Whatever she plants.
Sounds like a good plan. Is she a good cook?
Yep.
So this was a garden in addition to a garden you already had, or separate?
Separate.
So this would now be the day after Friday the 20th. This would now be May 21st, 2016?
Yep.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Did you see the defendant in that morning?
Yes.
What time?
Probably about noon, somewhere around there.
So that's the first you saw him was around noon?
Yep.
Do you remember what time you left for the trip?
We probably headed down probably around 1:30, 2 o'clock.
In the afternoon?
Yes.
Did Linda go?
No.
Take you how long to get down to Racine?
2.5 hours.
Did you go fishing that day?
Yes.
Who all was on the boat?
Me, Steve, Mike, and Jimmy.
And again, Steve, you mean the defendant?
Yes.
What size boat is this?
It's a 30-foot Sea Ray.
Is that a specific boat designed for fishing?
Pretty much.
Does it have like those seats that are fishing seats, or is it more a boat?
More of a wide open back.
And how wide is the boat approximately?
About 10 feet wide.
So a boat that size, what's the area where the occupants would be roughly?
About 10 by 15.
Kind of close quarters?
Yes.
Now, you see the defendant here today. Is that the hairstyle he had back in May of 2016?
No.
How would you describe his hair?
Shaved.
Do you recall the defendant wearing a hat on May 21st, that Saturday?
No.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to talk at the same time you are. If you just want to give me a moment to finish the question, I don't want to talk over you. So his hair was shaved pretty close to the scalp at that point in time?
Yes.
In the morning hours before you left for Racine, did the defendant share any stories from the night before?
You're watching the testimony of Ed Jackson. He's a friend of George Burch, the defendant in this case, talking about them living together and also going on this fishing trip right around when the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden happened. So it's a very important witness, both a witness to talk about George Burch himself, or Steve, or Big Country as his nicknames are. And as we're going to go to a quick break, And as soon as we come back, we'll go back into the courtroom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We are waiting for another feed back in the George Burch courtroom out of Wisconsin. The jury is listening, but what happens right now, there's a sidebar between the attorneys and the judge about the witness who's on the stand, Ed Jackson, a friend of the defendant, talking about what happened right around Nicole Vanderheiden's murder, about going on a fishing trip, and also about his experience with the defendant. So as soon as we have a live feed back in that courtroom, we're going to make sure to talk about it. But I want to switch gears to another case that we're covering here on Law and Crime Live, and that's the Bradley Farrington case out of New Mexico. And to help me talk a little bit about this case, I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst and fellow host here on the network, Stephanie Willis. Stephanie, recap for our viewers. We have a case, a man who was a former police officer is charged with his wife's murder, but he wasn't actually pinpointed in the murder until much later on. What's going on here?
Much later. That's the thing that is kind of crazy about this case, is that I think it was like a year and a half after the crime actually occurred that he was later arrested. And so I know that they're looking into the fact that there was some domestic abuse or some domestic violence issues prior to this crime, and also the fact that they were separated and they were trying to get a divorce.
That is not a good timeline for the defendant there when you're separated and you're trying to get a divorce and there's problems, and then all of a sudden your wife gets killed. Not looking good for Bradley Farrington, and the case hasn't even started. But again, we'll have to cover it as soon as we have a live feed. We do have a live feed back now in the Burch case. Again, we expect right now the testimony of Ed Jackson. And again, this is a good friend of Burch, the defendant. Let's listen in.
Yes.
And did you drive the defendant back to your home then at the conclusion on Sunday?
On Sunday, yes.
Did you have good luck on Sunday also?
Yes, we did.
On the drive back to your home, did the defendant bring up any unusual topics or indicate anything unusual taking place on May 20th or May 21st before you went fishing?
No.
Did there come a time following your fishing trip that you became aware of any news reports with respect to the homicide that had taken place in the Hoffman Road area?
I'm on Channel 11 News.
You remember watching the news on TV, it was?
Yes.
Was anyone with you when you observed this?
A couple times, Linda, and also Steve.
You do remember the defendant being present in the room when the report came on?
Yes.
Did you happen to recall, was he there more than once when news was reported on this subject?
It was at least once or twice, yes.
And did the news reports, without going into it, did they go into some of the detail of to what had been learned at that point with respect to the homicide?
Yes.
Where would you have been watching this?
What do you mean?
Where were you, at your home?
Oh, yes.
What room?
In the living room.
Okay. And do you recall remarking when you learned about this murder anything about the case itself?
Yes.
What did you say?
I said the scumbag that did it ought to be taken down.
Did the defendant have any response to that comment?
Not at all.
Did you notice his attention or his demeanor when these reports would come on?
He was pretty intensely looking at the TV.
On May 21st, at any point in time, either before you left your house, in the car, or on the boat with the defendant, did you notice any injuries to his head?
No.
Did you have a good view of his head during that time period?
Yes.
Didn't see any bruising?
No.
No swelling?
No.
No abrasions?
No.
No contusions?
No.
And he had no hat on for that time period you were on the boat?
No hat.
On June 8th, 2016, did you learn that your vehicle had been involved in a hit and run?
Yes.
Did you then learn also at that time period that it had then suffered fire damage?
Yes.
And when I say your vehicle, I'm referring to the red Blazer that you spoke of earlier, not the car you or your wife drove. Is that correct?
Correct.
Did the police come to your home?
Yes.
Is that how you first became aware of it?
Yes.
Following it, did you go view your vehicle once you made this discovery? Did you go take a look at the vehicle?
Yes.
And did you then observe any damage to the vehicle aside from fire damage?
Yes.
Where was that mainly?
The right front corner.
And did you see if in fact there was fire damage?
Yes.
And where did that appear to be?
Front seat.
Was it in the trunk? Was it in the engine area?
No. In the passenger compartment.
On June 8, 2016, the defendant was still living with you, is that correct?
Yes.
And he had his own bedroom, is that right?
Yes.
Did you allow him to bring women home? Did you have any rules against it?
No.
So that was okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Ed Jackson, and this is crucial testimony if you're following this case. This is a man that was living with Burch, and he just said that he didn't observe any injuries to Burch's head, which would disprove the defense theory that George Burch was knocked out by Douglas Dietrich. Also, he said that when he saw the news report about Nicole's murder, George Burch was just staring at the television and did not say a word. This is not good for the defense, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We have some really big testimony happening right now out of the George Burch case, a man who's charged with the murder of a young mother. Right now, Ed Jackson's on the stand. He's a friend of the defendant, and he just testified to many important things. Number one, the fact when Nicole's murder, again, Nicole Vanderheiden is the murdered mother here, when the news reports came out in the media, he was with the defendant when this happened, and all George Burch did was stare at the television and did not say a word. Also, it should be noted that he just testified that George Burch had no injuries to the back of his head, which would refute the theory put forward by the defense that George Burch was attacked by Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, who they claim was the actual murderer. And right now, he's going over a series of photos. This is of his car that was ultimately wrecked by George Burch, the defendant. It was a hit and run, which eventually led the police to George Burch, which led them to charge him in connection with the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden. Real quick, I'm here with Stephanie Willis. This guy right here, Ed Jackson, is a crucial witness for the state, and it's not looking good for the defense.
It's not looking good for the defense at all, especially due to the fact that Edward Jackson is supposedly his really good friend. And so, you know, you'd think that maybe a really good friend would maybe want to err on the side of the defendant here in this case. But he's sitting here and he's saying, one, there's no injury to his head the day after, a couple of days after when they went on their fishing trip. Second, the news media reports when he finds out that Nicole's body is found, there's no exclamation, there's no emotion, there's nothing like that. He just stays silent.
And staring at the television screen, staring at it. Now, the thing about the injuries is important because we should note that George Burch, if you see him in the courtroom right now, has a long ponytail. But back in the day, he had a shaved head, which would basically show if there was an injury to the back of his head, if he was knocked out by Douglas Dietrich, knocked out unconscious, you would imagine seeing something. You don't see anything. That is such a crucial witness right there for the prosecution, and you see the prosecution, again, going through a series of photos right now with this witness. Again, you hear how they're really pinpointing the case against George Burch now. Yeah. I can only imagine. What do you think the defense is going to do into cross-examination of this witness?
Well, you know what? I think this is going to be a relatively hard cross-examination because he's coming off as very credible to the members of the jury. I mean, like I said previously, this is supposed to be somebody who's his friend. So for him to come across and then just say it is what it is, I mean, I don't see how the defense is going to come back and cross-examine. I think you brought up a great point in regards to his head being shaved at the time. The jury members see that he has a long ponytail, so they're wondering to themselves, well, maybe it wouldn't have been seen. But I thought it was important that the prosecution also brought out the fact that he did not have on a hat. Yep. So when they went on this fishing trip, it would have been quite visible if there were some injuries to his head.
You hear the prosecution dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. Let's listen in right now to the live testimony.
Leave for good or just leave for a short time period?
For good.
Did you purchase anything for him at this point in time?
We purchased him a bus ticket to go back to Virginia.
On September 7th of 2016, is it correct you met with Brown County Sheriff's Department individuals? Correct. You gave them statements, is that correct?
Correct.
You gave them access to your phone?
Yes.
In fact, you made them aware of this photo, is that correct?
Correct.
I'm sorry, the fishing trip photo?
Yep.
I don't have any further questions, thank you.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, thank you. You may step down. You want him excused?
Yes, we'd ask them to be excused, please. Thank you, sir.
Jackson is excused. Your next witness.
Well, that was surprising. No cross-examination by the defense of such a key witness. Yeah. Stephanie, can you explain that?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. There's nothing that they could really cross-examine here. It's the fact that he's providing objective evidence here for the members of the jury. There's nothing that's subjective. He's saying what he saw. And it's the fact that as a defense attorney, if you're going to come back, there'd be nothing that you could say unless it would be something that would be combative, excuse me. And you really don't want to do that with members of the jury because you want them to see reasonable doubt. And if
I don't know,
you don't think so?
Their whole case rounds about him having injuries to his head because he was knocked out by Douglas Dietrich. Couldn't you say, Mr. Jackson, you wear glasses. Mr. Jackson, how close were you to him? Mr. Jackson, do you have experience with seeing injuries on people's heads? I don't know. I'm just making stuff up.
No, I think those are all very valid points, but it's to the extent of how far are you willing to go. I think that maybe the defense is thinking that when we put on our case, we'll be able to further explain maybe why, there were no visible injuries to his head. But as far as with this particular witness, I don't think it would have done much for the jury.
All right. Well, we have a new witness coming on the stand. This is, again, the case of George Burch, charged in the murder of a young mother. And his defense team is saying it wasn't him. It was Nicole's boyfriend. Very interesting case. New witness is coming to the stand. And we just heard an explosive testimony from Ed Jackson. So let's listen into this one.
Whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready. Oh.
Thank you. Are you able to get that to work?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Are you just getting over a cold?
Yes, I am.
You need to refresh yourself. Feel free. And I'm going to ask you, how old are you?
Really? 57.
I won't ask any other personal questions. Do you know an Ed Jackson?
Yes, I do.
How long have you known him?
About 8 years.
And have you been together for some time?
6 years plus.
Did you marry him?
Yes, I did.
And when was that?
August 13th of 16.
And do you live in the Green Bay area?
Yes.
Well, after the explosive testimony of Ed Jackson, the friend of the defendant in this case, this is the wife of Ed Jackson. And you can only imagine what she's going to testify to. Remember, she was in close proximity to George Burch, the defendant. And now we're going to have to hear. We have to go to a short break, but as soon as we come back, we're going to go right back into that courtroom. You're not going to miss anything. We'll be back in a minute. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We are back in the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. And right now, Linda Jackson, who is the wife of Ed Jackson, is on the stand. Both her and her husband were the ones that housed George Burch, the defendant in this case, right around the time of the Nicole Vander Heiden murder. And you just heard explosive testimony from her husband about the fact he observed no injuries on George Burch, despite the defense attorney's claims. And also, it should be noted that when news broke about Nicole's murder, the victim in this case, George Burch just stared at the screen and did nothing. Now you're listening to Linda Jackson talking about when George first made that move towards their house, and she purchased the ticket for him. Let's listen in live.
I never talked about it, but he's an adult, so.
Okay. So there's no rule against it, is that correct?
No.
In fact, did you ever see him with any women?
Yeah, he had a girl that he's spent a lot of time with, and her name was Jordan.
Now, did the defendant arrive in town with a working phone?
Yes.
A phone that was working?
Yes.
On May 20th of 2016, is there anything you did with respect to him and having access to phones?
Yes, his phone, he told me his ex-wife was going to cancel their plan, so he would not have a phone, and he was going to get one from Walmart, but they don't work in the house very well because we've had other people that have had that happen. So I took him to Cellcom, and that afternoon, or about 5 o'clock, I got him a phone on my plan.
So you got an additional phone
Yes.
for your plan?
Yes.
It wasn't a phone you had sitting around the house already?
No.
Okay. And you literally put him on your plan, is that correct?
Yes.
And who made the payments for that?
I made him, but he was going to pay me when he got paid.
Okay. And he did work from time to time while he lived with you, did he not?
Yes.
Did he get behind in the payments for the phone?
Yes.
Did he get behind in payments for the rent?
Yes. Ed had mentioned that.
He continued to live in the bedroom, though, is that correct?
Yeah.
And he continued to use the blazer, is that right?
Yep.
Are you aware of any certain bars or taverns that he frequented?
I know one of the main ones was Richard Cranium's.
Were you ever there with him?
We went there the weekend that we were celebrating Ed's birthday. On a Saturday night, he met us at another bar, Mikey's, and then we ended up at Richard Cranium's.
It was going to be said sooner or later. So you went there at least one occasion with him, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you remember a fishing trip that your husband and the defendant took to Racine in May of 2016?
Yes.
You didn't go with them, is that correct?
No.
Do you remember if you saw them in the morning before they left?
Well, I know I saw Ed before and I think I went to work that day.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. But I know I wasn't home. But he always calls me and tells me he's going fishing.
Is that one of his favorite hobbies?
Absolutely.
Do you remember, were you working at all in your garden that morning, or do you remember what hours you went to work?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But I know that I got a picture from Ed because he finished my herb garden that day. The base. He put an herb garden together for me.
Oh, he sent you a picture of it?
Yes.
That's nice. Were you aware what time he took off? And if you weren't there, that's fine.
No.
Was the plan that he was going to be gone, leave Saturday, get back Sunday?
Yes.
Okay, and is that in fact what took place?
Yeah.
And the defendant was going with them, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you know the gentleman with whom they were going to go fishing with?
Yes.
And that's who?
Mike Hankey, A1 Charters.
You've met him before, is that?
Oh, yes. He's been a long-time family friend.
And you're friends with his wife also?
Absolutely.
Now, back in May of 2016, how would you describe the defendant's hairstyle?
Short. I wouldn't say his head was never shaven, but it was very, very short.
Very different than it is today, is that correct?
Yes.
Following their fishing trip, did they return to your house on Sunday?
Yeah.
Did you see both of them?
I believe so.
Did you notice anything unusual about the defendant's head when you saw him after the fishing trip?
No.
Notice any injuries to his head?
No.
Again, that's Linda Jackson, the wife of Ed Jackson. She confirmed the same thing that Ed did on the stand earlier, that George Burch, the defendant in this case, had no injuries to the back of his head, which is inconsistent with the defendant's theory, the defense's theory, that George Burch was the victim in this case, that he was attacked by Nicole's boyfriend. Let's listen back in as she testifies.
George with his fish that he caught.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked Exhibit 113. Do you recognize, in fact, that photo?
Yes, I do. That was one that Ed had sent me that day.
So on May 21st, on this Racine fishing trip, that's the photo that was sent to you by your husband, Ed?
Yes.
And who's shown in that photo?
George.
Okay, the defendant's shown?
Yes.
And he's got a nice-sized fish, is that correct?
Yeah.
Do you usually get bigger ones?
Yes.
Wow, okay.
Sorry.
I have a lot to learn about fishing. So with respect to that, the hairstyle that he's shown in that photo, is that about how you recall it in May of 2016?
Yes.
Now, after...
Stephanie, you gotta love these witnesses. Was that a big fish? Nah.
Nah, not really. I've seen bigger. That's what she said.
It's amazing because right now this is an important witness. This is Linda Jackson, the wife of Ed Jackson. Again, both of them lived with Burch You just heard Burch was behind on his rent payments, and she bought him a cell phone that went on her plan, and he was behind in those payments as well. And they just talked about the fishing trip he was on, and he didn't have any injuries despite the defense's claims. A lot at stake here. We're going to go to a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We are covering the live trial of George Burch out of Wisconsin. We've been watching the testimony right now of Linda Jackson, who is the wife of Ed Jackson, and both of them housed George Burch, the defendant in this case, right around the time of Nicole Vanderheyden's murder. That's what this is all about, the murder of Nicole Vanderheyden. Who did it? And right now, you didn't miss much in the commercial break. They were just publishing some photos. It's more of a preliminary issue. Again, I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst and fellow host here on the network, Stephanie Willis. Stephanie, as the prosecution pokes holes in the defense's case here, what, for you, is the most flimsy part of the defense's theory as of yet?
The flimsiest part of the defense's theory is the fact that he was there. I mean, he was around in the crime scene. I can't really get around the fact that, okay, now everybody's saying that there was no injuries to his head. His story just does not seem very plausible to me at all. But I just can't seem to get around the fact that he was there at her home.
Right.
Like, how did he get there?
Because the theory is that the defense will say that George Burch met Nicole, had sexual relations with her outside of her house, and then he was attacked by Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, and that he was the one who ultimately killed Nicole. Let's go back to a live feed and listen in on Linda Jackson.
Accurate with respect to the steps that you have taken?
Yes.
You find it to be generally accurate to not show steps when you're not moving?
No.
It's not accurate?
Oh, yeah, it is accurate, yeah.
Okay. So overall, it's generally accurate for your activity, is that correct? Or your not activity?
Both. I mean...
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Okay.
Cross-examination.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Ms. Jackson.
Morning.
Just a few more questions for you. When George, or Steve as you know him, got here from Virginia, did he have a job lined up?
No, but he only took him 2 days to get one.
Okay, so he got a job within the first 2 days of being
Yes.
here? What was that job?
He worked at Blackstone as a manager and cook,
Okay.
assistant manager and cook.
And did he start working there
Yes.
essentially the day he got the job?
Yep,
He worked long hours?
a lot, yes,
They essentially worked him like a dog?
absolutely,
And you were able to observe that, seeing how you were living with him?
yes,
And you and Ed kind of encouraged him or counseled him to maybe find a different opportunity?
exactly,
Okay, so you helped him make the decision to leave Blackstone?
yep,
Okay. And after he left Blackstone, he got another job doing landscaping, is that correct?
yes, at NEW Landscaping,
Okay. And he worked there regularly,
yeah,
every day?
yeah,
Okay. And are you aware, NEW Landscaping, what kind of work Steve was doing during the days?
yeah, they would haul dirt and do landscaping.
Okay. So,
We really never talked about what he did, but I do know that that's what they do there, so.
okay. Now, I think you said on May 20th that Ed was working on your herb garden,
Yes,
and you knew that?
Objection, I don't think that's the testimony, May 20th.
no, not the 20th, but the
Hold on.
21st.
Linda, just hold on for a second. The question was, what day, May 20th?
I could have misspoke. I can just ask Ms. Jackson.
Why don't rewind and ask the question again?
Which day was it that you remember Ed working on your herb garden?
I know he worked on the 21st, because he sent me a picture. But I do know that Steve, George, and I worked on it another day as well, because we had to take out the old herb garden to put the new one in. So it was not just done that day.
So it's, okay. And so you said Steve had helped you with that project?
Mm-hmm.
He helped you with all sorts of projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes,
And you believe it was that May 21st that Steve and Ed ended up going on that fishing trip?
yes,
And you recall that because they were sending you photos of the fish they were catching.
yes,
And that was the same day that earlier in the day, Ed had sent you the photo of the herb garden.
yes,
Now, back back in 2016, do you remember meeting with law enforcement about this matter?
I think it was September of 2016.
You went to the Brown County Sheriff's Office and spoke with law enforcement?
Yes,
They specifically told you why they were talking to you?
yes,
And that was they were investigating Mr. Burch's role in I guess, a death. Did they tell you
yeah,
that?
yes,
And they essentially were just asking you about anything and everything you may know or may not know about that.
yes,
And they were asking you questions about specific dates,
yes,
specific vehicles,
yep,
and also just kind of general background stuff about his job and how you knew him.
yes,
And when they were asking you about dates, you used your phone, calendar, and text messages to kind of piece things together.
yes,
And when you were discussing the fishing trip with them, when you were trying to figure out that time, you actually used your phone to find those photographs, find those texts, so you could tell him what had happened.
yeah,
So when you were meeting with law enforcement, you were looking at your phone, looking at those photographs. Well, let me rephrase that question. You can just ignore everything I just said. That photograph that we just talked about and gave to the jury, that was one of those photographs that was sent to you.
yes,
And you were looking at it on your phone when you were meeting with law enforcement.
yes,
And law enforcement was asking you if there was anything unusual that you could think of regarding that time frame.
yes,
And again, you had that photo in front of you,
yes,
and you knew they were looking into George's role, or suspicion of his role in this.
yes,
And you reported that there's absolutely nothing that sticks out to you about being unusual.
At the time, it didn't, I mean, it was pretty shocking. So, and trying to remember dates, had a lot going on that summer,
Right.
so,
So again, at that time, you had this photograph, you had looked at it, and you didn't make any notice, or you didn't let law enforcement know of anything that was suspicious at that time.
correct.
Because at that time, you didn't remember anything suspicious.
Yeah, they just went fishing.
And he didn't have any, you didn't tell law enforcement, or actually you just said he didn't have any injuries to his head?
I didn't see him that day before he went fishing, but I didn't see anything when they came home.
Okay, and that's not only his head, but his whole body, nothing stuck out to you, right?
Yeah,
Okay. Just a brief question about what you said on your earlier testimony. What is it that's on your wrist?
it's Cellcom's version of Fitbit.
So it's not a Fitbit?
No,
Okay. I have no further questions, thank you.
All right, any redirect, Attorney Kerrigan-Maris?
You were asked about phones. Did the defendant ever give you back the phone that you had loaned him?
no,
Nothing further.
Anything on that?
Just briefly. Once Mr. Burch stopped residing with you, he did make some back payments towards you, correct?
yes,
No further questions.
All right, Ms. Jackson, thank you. You may step down.
thank you.
And you are really excused. Let's have another witness.
Suit calls Officer Bordeley.
Again, that was the testimony of Linda Jackson. Let's break down her testimony here with Stephanie Willis. I thought she was a good witness.
I did too.
I mean, talking about the idea of she didn't notice anything unusual about George Burch. But then again, if this guy just committed a murder or was forced to hide the body, as the defense says, something's amiss.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. You would think that something would have happened. Like, if I'm just thinking of generally of a normal person in this horrible situation. If that would have happened and you're living with someone, wouldn't you have said, "Oh my gosh, this is the guy that hit me over the head," or something like that the other night? There was complete silence. He didn't talk about it at all. He didn't say anything to either one of them. And Edward Jackson is supposed to be his good friend. Another thing that I thought that was pretty interesting was the fact that during cross-examination, the defense brought up the fact that it took him only 2 days to find a job once he arrived, and that he worked long hours. I think that they did that to combat the fact that the prosecution brought out that he was late on his rent payments.
What's the point in saying he's late on rent payments? He didn't pay the cell phone bills on time. What's the point in showing that?
I think it just goes against his character. I mean, somebody who's just.
But the judge let that in.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I just thought it was a good way for them to combat that a little bit, but I just don't even see the point of it.
Well, let's see. We have a new witness on the stand. This appears to be a law enforcement officer. Let's listen in live.
That day.
About 7:30 a.m. I was dispatched to an auto theft complaint.
You know the location of the auto theft complaint?
912 South Greenwood Ave.
And when you arrived on scene, what did you do?
I spoke with complainant, Edward Jackson.
About what?
One of his vehicles was stolen overnight, apparently. Or Linda Clayton's vehicle, his fiance's vehicle.
Do you recall what type of vehicle it was?
99 Chevy Blazer.
Do you know who was allegedly driving that vehicle on a regular basis?
Ed told me the last person that drove the vehicle was his friend Steve.
And by Steve, you mean Mr. Burch?
Yes, George Stephen Burch.
Did you eventually have contact with Mr. Burch that morning?
Yes.
And do you see Mr. Burch in court here today?
Yes, I do.
Can you describe where he's seated and what he's wearing?
Seated at the defense table, wearing a blue plaid button-up shirt.
That's the record to reflect. The witness identify the defendant.
The record will so reflect.
Did the defendant provide information to you about the alleged vehicle theft?
Yes, he did.
And what was his statement to you at that time?
He indicated he had used the vehicle the previous night, and after he was done using it, he drove home, parked it in the driveway, and must have left it unlocked with the keys in it because this morning it was missing. That morning it was missing.
You recall where the defendant said he had been with the vehicle the previous night?
He said he had driven to Richard Cranium's bar, which was just a few blocks down the street.
So Richard Cranium's bar, just a few blocks from the Greenwood Avenue address?
Yes.
Did you actually observe the Blazer that morning on June 8th of 2016?
No, I didn't.
Were you aware that the vehicle had been involved in other incidents?
Yes.
What two incidents, in addition to the theft complaint, was that vehicle involved in?
Well, prior to being dispatched to the theft complaint, I had noticed, I had looked up prior calls in my area from the night before and noticed that that vehicle had been involved in a vehicle fire in the 800 block of South Maple Avenue. And while investigating the auto theft complaint, I spoke with one of my lieutenants, came to the scene, and he was able to find information that the vehicle was involved in a hit-and-run accident prior to the vehicle fire the night before.
And based on that, you were following up to obtain more information from the vehicle owner and the person who may have been using the vehicle regularly?
Yes.
You know the location of the hit and run?
400 block of Bader Street.
On the east side?
Yes.
As part of your investigation in the case, did you ask Mr. Burch to provide some information to you?
Yes, I did. He had indicated that he had been texting a friend of his that lived over on Bader Street while he was at the bar. At some point, I asked him myself, and my lieutenant asked him if he would be willing to show us the text messages between him and his friend.
And did he do that?
Yes, he gave us permission to look at his text messages. And at that point, I asked him if I could just take his phone to the department, have one of our analysts download the information off the phone just to make it easier to search through all the information.
Did you ask Mr. Burch to fill out a consent form?
Yes, I did.
And did he complete a consent form for the download of his phone?
Yes.
Officer Borla, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 124. Can you identify that?
So a City of Green Bay Police Department consent to search form.
Does that form involve the consent to search the cell phone that Mr. Burch provided to you?
Yes.
In fact, that's indicated on the form.
Yes.
After you received the form and the phone, what did you do?
Well, I took a written statement from Mr. Burch, and then I stopped at Richard Cranium's bar, spoke with the owner, looked at some of the video footage from the night before. He indicated he would download the footage for me. I left him a USB stick, and then I drove to the police department to have the phone information downloaded by our analyst.
You're watching the testimony of an officer from the Green Bay Police Department talking about interviewing George Burch because he was a suspect at the time in connection with the death of Nicole Vanderheiden. And now they're getting into really about reviewing the text messages between him, Burch, and a friend that night. So let's listen in and hear what the detective found, the police officer found.
With respect to the fire, were you able to obtain any information regarding that?
I did speak with members from the fire department, but based off of their report that was completed at the time that they arrived on the scene, I wasn't able to use any of that information to solve the vehicle fire or the auto theft.
And did they actually provide information that it's possible that the equipment in the vehicle was responsible for starting the fire?
I mean, I got a copy of the report, and based off of the information that was on it, it was inconclusive as far as I could determine.
Thank you. No further questions at this time.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
Yes, thank you. Officer Bordelai, this incident that you've been talking about, this was in June of 2016, correct?
Yes.
Do you remember the exact date? Was it June 8th?
June 8th, correct.
And when you were looking into these matters, Mr. Burch was cooperative that entire time, correct?
Yes.
He gave you consent to search his phone?
Correct.
He wanted to show you the text messages that he was sending that night?
I had asked him, we asked him if he's willing to show us that information, just to see if he would cooperate with that. And he did, so.
And then I'm just going to read directly from your report on June 10th. You concluded at this time there's no information to prove Steve was the one driving the Blazer during the accident. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then right in that same sentence, and an unknown cause for the fire other than possibly started on fire due to the damage from the accident, correct?
Yes.
And then just going into specifically what you referred to from the fire department, this is that same report. You were able to glean that the ignition of the fire was determined to be the operator-passenger area of the vehicle caused by a failure of equipment or heat source with contributing factors determined to be collision, knockdown, run over, or turnover. That's correct?
That's the information that was on the fire department's report.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Any redirect? Officer Bartley, thank you. You step down. You're excused, ladies and gentlemen. We'll take about a 15-minute morning break, and then we'll be back for the balance of the morning testimony.
All rise.
Welcome back, everybody. So that was an officer from the Green Bay Police Department talking about his investigation into George Burch and that hit and run. Remember, this is all centered around a vehicle that belonged to Ed Jackson. I'm here with Stephanie Willis. Stephanie, what did you make of that testimony? Again, remember, let's not forget, the reason the police were able to first investigate George Burch was because of that hit and run. And there was an issue before trial about whether or not investigating him for one thing could lead them to investigate him for a murder.
Right. And you have to kind of bring me up to speed. He was exonerated on this, well, not really exonerated, but he was put to the side for this hit and run case.
Right. Well, the issue was, of course, that he was being investigated for this hit and run. And the question became, could they start looking at his messages, things that were unrelated to the hit and run, because they did suspect him in connection with the death of Nicole Vanderheiden. In the end, it was ruled that was fine. He consented to it. And once you consent to one thing, you consent to everything. That's why you have to lawyer up.
Yeah, you have to lawyer up. It's important, people. And that's exactly what I was going to say. The fact that he consented to having or to allowing the police officers to look through his phone. As a matter of fact, he had a written consent. Yeah. They brought it to the police department. So, you know, it's all good there.
It's all good there. But what's not good is for George Burch, because the testimony so far has not been good for the defense. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll go back to the courtroom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We have updates in two of the cases we've been talking about this morning. The first one is the George Burch case. It is in a break right now. It's in a short recess, and as soon as there's a feed, we'll go back to it. But I also want to update our viewers about a case that I mentioned previously. It was the Bradley Farrington case out of New Mexico. A man, a former police officer, who was charged with the death of his wife. He was charged with the murder of his wife. Well, we just got a report that that case, even before it started, was declared a mistrial. That's right. The judge ruled that ruled a mistrial. There was some issue that happened over the weekend, and therefore a new trial will have to be going underway. That means a whole new jury will be selected, and it will have to start over, even though it really didn't start. But we should let our viewers know that there will be no feed of Farrington today because of what happened. But let's focus now on the George Burch case. We had a really important day of testimony. I want to bring in again my guest for right now, Law and Crime trial analyst and fellow host here on the network, Stephanie Willis. And Stephanie, you are going to be jumping in right after I sign off here on crime investigation. But let's just get some first impressions about this case. As the prosecution winds their case down, what else do they need to show? I mean, are we going to be seeing a little bit about Fitbit data? Because we know that's the crucial issue in this case. Right. And we heard a little bit of it today, because one of the witnesses was Linda Jackson. Now, she wasn't wearing a Fitbit, but she was wearing something similar to a Fitbit. What kind of data do you think they're going to bring in the either today or tomorrow?
Okay, so what we're assuming the data that they're going to bring in is the actual steps that I believe it was Douglas Dietrich had on the evening of the murder. So we know that initially this was a big deal because the defense did not want it brought in at all because of the fact that there was no Fitbit expert that was being brought in. So there was a whole bunch of preliminary issues regarding Dawbear and whether or not excuse me, not having an expert in would be to the detriment of the defense. So essentially what happened was the judge allowed this this Fitbit evidence in even without having an expert. But I do assume what I can say about this prosecution is I really like the way that they detail out the story throughout the trial. They are always reminding the members of the jury of things that are happening. For example, the fact that they talked about the hair, the fact that his hair was closely shaven down, or the fact that they just mentioned in that Fitbit, because we can assume that the Fitbit evidence is going to be the last big piece of evidence that they bring in. So I really like the way that they're weaving in a story here for the members of the jury.
Well, as they try to recap the story, let me recap the story for you. We are covering the George Burch case, a man who's charged with first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of Nicole Vanderheiden, a young mother out of Wisconsin. Her body was found 3 miles from her home. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. We know that's the cause of death. Now, George Burch, the defendant who we were showing you right there, his DNA was all over her body, and data from his cell phone indicates that he was in 4 key locations that night, including the crime scene where Nicole was murdered and where her body was found in a field. Now, despite all that evidence, the defense is saying he didn't do it, but it was Nicole's boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich, a name we keep bringing up this morning. Douglas Dietrich was her live-in boyfriend. She shared a child with him, and the defense is saying that he is the one that committed this crime. Now, what the defense will ultimately argue, or what we believe they will ultimately argue once the case goes to them, is that the defense will say that George Burch had sex with Nicole the night in question, right outside of the home that she shared with Douglas Dietrich, and George Burch was knocked out by Douglas. And when he woke up, Nicole was dead. That's right, that Doug killed her, and then Doug forced George to get rid of the body. Think about that story. Does it make sense to you? Well, it might not make sense to the jurors, and it definitely doesn't make sense to the state. And what I want to play for you right now is the testimony of Edward Jackson, who is a friend of George Burch. George Burch was living with Edward and Linda, his wife. You heard this testimony earlier today. Listen carefully, because this really does refute the theory put forward by the defense. Let's listen.
Good luck on Sunday also?
Yes, we did.
On the drive back to your home, did the defendant bring up any unusual topics or indicate anything unusual taking place on May 20th or May 21st before you went fishing?
No.
Did there come a time following your fishing trip that you became aware of any news reports with respect to the homicide that had taken place in the Hoffman Road area?
I'm on Channel 11 News.
You remember watching the news on TV, it was?
Yes.
Was anyone with you when you observed this?
A couple times, Linda, and also Steve.
You do remember the defendant being present in the room when the report came on?
Yes.
Did you happen to recall, was he there more than once when news was reported on this subject?
There was at least once or twice, yes.
And did the news reports, without going into it, did they go into some of the detail of to what had been learned at that point with respect to the homicide?
Yes.
Where would you have been watching this?
What do you mean?
Where were you, at your home?
Oh, yes.
What room?
In the living room.
Okay. And do you recall remarking when you learned about this murder, anything about the case itself?
Yes.
What did you say?
I said the scumbag that did it ought to be taken down.
Did the defendant have any response to that comment?
Not at all.
Did you notice his attention or his demeanor when these reports would come on?
He was pretty intensely looking at the TV.
On May 21st, at any point in time, either before you left your house, in the car, or on the boat with the defendant, did you notice any injuries to his head?
No.
Did you have a good view of his head during that time period?
Yes.
You didn't see any bruising?
No.
No swelling?
No.
No abrasions?
No.
No contusions?
No.
As Ed Jackson just said, George Burch didn't react to the news of Nicole Vanderheiden's murder when she was all in the news. And also, he didn't have any injuries to his head. Again, that refutes the claim put forward by the defense that George Burch was attacked by Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, and then forced to move her body. But that was not the only witness today that confirmed that story. Let's listen in to Linda Jackson, Ed's wife.
Richard Craniums.
Were you ever there with him?
We went there the weekend that we were celebrating Ed's birthday. On a Saturday night, he met us at another bar, Mikey's, and then we ended up at Richard Craniums.
It was going to be said sooner or later.
Yeah.
So you went there at least one occasion with him, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you remember a fishing trip that your husband and the defendant took to Racine in May of 2016?
Yes.
You didn't go with them, is that correct?
No.
Do you remember if you saw them in the morning before they left?
Well, I know I saw Ed before and I think I went to work that day.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. But I know I wasn't home. But he always calls me and tells me he's going fishing.
Is that one of his favorite hobbies?
Absolutely.
Do you remember, were you working at all in your garden that morning, or do you remember the hours you went to work?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But I know that I got a picture from Ed because he finished my herb garden that day. The base. He put an herb garden together for me.
Oh, he sent you a picture of it?
Yes.
That's nice. Were you aware what time he took off, and if you weren't there, that's fine?
No.
Was the plan that he was going to be gone, leave Saturday, get back Sunday?
Yes.
Okay, and is that in fact what took place?
Yeah.
And the defendant was going with them, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you know the gentleman with whom they were going to go fishing with?
Yes.
And that's who?
Mike Hankey, A1 Charters.
You've met him before?
Oh, yes. He's been a long-time family friend.
And you're friends with his wife also?
Absolutely.
Now, back in May of 2016, how would you describe the defendant's hairstyle?
Short. I wouldn't say his head was never shaven, but it was very, very short.
Very different than it is today, is that correct?
Yes.
Following their fishing trip, did they return to your house on Sunday?
Yeah.
Did you see both of them?
I believe so.
Did you notice anything unusual about the defendant's head when you saw him after the fishing trip?
No.
Notice any injuries to his head?
No.
That's the state poking holes in the defense's theory that their client George Burch is not the killer, but it was Douglas Dietrich, Nicole Vanderheiden, the victim in this case, that it was her boyfriend. As you heard from those two witnesses, It's not going to be so simple for the defense to prove. I want to close out my time here with Stephanie Willis. Stephanie, not a good day for the defense.
No, not a good day for the defense at all. The prosecution is really bringing in and honing in on their case at this point, and that's what you would expect them to do because they're winding down to the end of their case in chief. And so I think that they're doing a very good job, as I said before, laying down the little pieces of bread or tying in the necklace so that the jury at the end of their case in chief can have a full picture of what happened that evening.
Let's not forget we are talking about Nicole Vanderheiden, this beautiful young mother out of Wisconsin, taken in the prime of her life, and as most people have testified, she was a great mom. Stephanie, do you think by the end of this trial we'll get some justice for Nicole?
Well, that's what we're all hoping. I mean, we can never know what the hands of the jury. Juries are very spontaneous, members of the jury, and but the way that it's looking right now, we do hope that we can get some justice for Nicole because at the end of the day, that's why we have this case. It's for justice.
But it's not so much we never find the truth, right? It's what you can prove.
It is what you can prove, and that at the end of the day, that's what the court of law is. It's what the prosecution, who has the burden of proof, can prove. And until we see what the defense brings, then I think we'll have a full picture of how we can answer that question.
Real quick, you think George Burch is going to take the stand? I think he has to.
I think he does too. I think that it would only serve his interest if he does. The only thing is that he does have a little bit of a pass, but hopefully he can get over that hump.
What, not everybody's charged with 2 murders in their lifetime? Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse.
So we will be signing out here on the crime investigation, but Stephanie will be taking over at lawandcrime.com. We're going to continue our coverage today, our live coverage of the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. And if the rest of the day is anything like it was this morning, it's important testimony to follow. A big case, and we are wondering if we'll get justice for Nicole. That becomes the question. It's been a lot at stake for many people here, Douglas Dietrich, George Burch, and Nicole. A lot of answers, a lot of questions, and wondering if we can get answers to those questions. You saw some explosive testimony today, and you want to stay tuned. We're going to sign off here. We'll be back tomorrow, 9 a.m. on Crime and Investigation. Thank you again.